please. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Searcy. I'm an associate professor here at Southern Wesleyan, and this is our third SWU Literary Festival. It's the first time we've done it in here 2 years ago. We did our first one over in Founders in the basement of the CAF. It was like 2 weeks before COVID hit. And last year we were still dealing with that, so we went entirely virtual. We recorded our readings. This year we're trying something new for our readers. I'm sorry if there's background noise, but the benefit of that is hopefully we will capture some readers' attention or listeners' attention that we wouldn't have had otherwise. The festival was made possible with a grant by SC Humanities, which is a not-for-profit organization that inspires, engages, and enriches the lives of South Carolinians with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. I have lots of people to thank, but I'm going to save that credit sequence for when the festival is over. Just know the fact that this is going down was not primarily because of me. A lot of people worked hard to make today happen, particularly our keynote speakers and our student writers. So our theme for this year, and frankly for every year we have the festival, is going to be the same until we stop getting good work. It is South Carolina, Real and Imagined. So the student writers, either high school students or college students, are asked to submit poetry, fiction, or creative nonfiction that is focused on or set in South Carolina. As I've been preparing for the festival, I've been reading the work of David Foster Wallace, and a friend of mine asked me why I cared about his work so much, and I have to say this seems petty, but one of the reasons I love his work is that he name checks the 3 small Midwest towns I grew up in his excellent nonfiction and fiction. Galesburg, Illinois, Urbandale, Iowa, and Paducah, Kentucky make appearances in his work. And if you've never heard of those towns, that's kind of the point. The fact that a writer of Wallace's stature would see those towns, even if in the essay Derivative Sport in Tornado Alley, he calls Galesburg, which is my birthplace, a, quote, serious corn town. But out of all the serious corn towns in all the world, Ken, he saw mine. And the feeling I got when I saw Urbandale, Iowa in The Pale King, or saw that a major character in Infinite Jest was from a small town near Paducah, Kentucky, revealed to me something I knew I may not have been able to articulate, that something as simple as a proper noun, a name of a place, can evoke a cavalcade of thoughts and memories. And really, that's what the work that you'll hear today demonstrates. You'll hear a poet who talks about growing up in South Carolina when you're not from South Carolina. You'll hear a piece of sci-fi that sets a space war in and around our state's capital. And you'll also hear some poetry that focuses on the plants and wildlife of this state and the places where nature and culture collide. I encourage you to listen to the writers of this year's festival well, because if you do, what I hope will happen is that you will arrive at South Carolina where you started and find perhaps that you know this place for the first time. Our first keynote speaker is Jeremy Jones, who's an associate professor of English at Western Carolina. He's the author of the award-winning memoir Bear Wallow, A Personal History of a Mountain Homeland. He's had essays published in the Oxford American and the Iowa Review and Brevity. And those are the biographical details that you have to give for a writer of Jeremy's stature, but I also pulled them straight off of his website. I wanted to give 3 small, more personal notes. One, Jeremy and I worked together at Charleston Southern University for a couple of years, and he was the dude you asked if you wanted to play pickup basketball on Saturday mornings in Charleston. And he was also the guy who taught me the guitar chords to the Backstreet Boys' I Want It That Way. So he's that guy too. Number 2, one of my favorite pieces of his is in a collection called Appalachian Reckoning, which was a response to J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. And Jeremy writes basically a love letter to Ernest T. Bass, the character from the Andy Griffith Show. And I can count on one hand the number of times I've read something that was so funny I cried, and that's one of them. Jeremy can do poignant really well. Bear Wallow demonstrates that. But he can do hilarious too, and then he'll hit you with the poignancy punch. I would highly encourage you to seek that essay out. And then finally, in the author's note to Bear Wallow, Jeremy writes, "This book is a memoir not only about my life, but also about the life of a place." So I couldn't think of a better way to start this year's festival than to have Jeremy help us think about how our lives and the lives of the places we live in connect. Please join me in welcoming Jeremy Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Searcy, and everybody else who had a hand in making this. I direct a literary festival at Western, and I know there's a lot more that happens behind the scenes than people know about, so I appreciate everybody who had a hand in this. I'm going to set a timer here just to keep myself honest. So the winners are out here somewhere, I guess. I just also wanted to say before I start, congratulations to the winners. My suspicion, I don't want to put thoughts in your head, is that you're feeling some nerves, but I hope you'll overlay those feelings with some sense of accomplishment and celebration. There's a weird thing that happens when you're a writer and you work in private for so long on something, and then it immediately becomes public in some form. Someone reads it or you say it out loud, and it's a kind of breakneck turn, I think, in the artistic process. So whatever you're feeling, I hope you'll know that this is a kind of mark on a timeline of this piece you've created, a kind of celebratory moment. And it's also a kind of moment of creation. Like when you read something or print something, it takes on all these new lives, right? We all kind of carry with us characters and lines from things we've read. So when you share your work today, that's going to happen. It's going to populate this room. So try to think of, over top of those butterflies, you're also creating something new today. You're giving that piece you've created a new and kind of abundant life. So before I start talking about what I want to talk about, I want to tell you how I came to talk about it. And it's going to sound a little bit foolish, but for some years what I've done when I feel like I need to know something is I've sort of forced myself into a situation where I have to write about it or talk about it publicly, which doesn't necessarily make sense, but something about the pressure of that forces me into the work, the sort of intellectual work or the research or whatever. So an example is I'm writing a book right now that I think is kind of fusing memoir and biography in these kind of sort of hybrid form. I don't know how to do that. And so I decided, what I should do is give a talk about it. And so I created this panel for this the AWP, which is sort of the National Writers Conference next month, about what we're calling BioGuar, biography and memoir married. And I assembled these 4 other people who do have smart things to say about it, in part because I knew that forcing myself to do it would make me go and kind of think about it and write about it. But it also lets me sit on stage with 4 other people and take notes. Like I'm sort of up there as if I know what I'm doing, but really what I've done is created a situation where I can have my own little mini educational experience. I'm manipulating things is what I'm telling you. And so essentially that's what I've done today. I'm approaching the final section of that book that I'm trying to write. I'm trying to think about place in ways that I haven't thought about so far in the book. And I was a little bit stumped. And so I was like, I know what I'll do. I'll talk about that at SWU's Literary Festival, which just kind of forced me to do the work I knew I needed to do, to pull up some discernible bits, hopefully to give away. But in this scenario, that makes you the panelist, so what I'm kind of hoping is to get something out of you. I've come here to steal from you. So if anything I say kind of like flickers a question or makes you think of something you've read or gives you some insight, even if we don't have time, after I talk, I hope you'll just catch me in between things and say, hey, that made me think of this book, or I have this idea, because I'm here for that. So I feel like I need to kind of orient you just to my place. As Dr. Cersei said, I'm from Western North Carolina. I grew up in a small community called Fruitland, which is not really that far from here. It's about an hour and a half from here. And I grew up on 100 acres of my father's family's land, which we had been on for 4 generations by that point. And that kind of runs down to this creek. Across that creek is my mom's family's land, which they've been on for like 7 generations. And so as a kid, I was just kind of to make room for a pickup with no engine. You read how the upright piano was left upright by the trail, the soundboard ticking in the wind, in the heat, how the young mother was buried and left in a grave marked only by the seat of a broken chair, with her name, Sephora, and the date scratched into the varnish, and only a lock of her hair to go west. There are hundreds of graves like that left in the deep grass, on low rises overlooking the ruts that lead on. I tell you that everything here, the auto lot spread in the sun, the 12-story bank with its pigeons, the new elementary school flat as a box lid blown off the back of something going farther on, the insurance agent with a briefcase, the beautiful Pakistani surgeon, all these and more, for some reason, have been too burdensome, too big, or too small, or too awkward to make it the rest of the way. So any memories of stuff, any objects that kind of still stick in your head that he gives? This is sort of a litany of litter, he says, a bunch of junk that makes up Nebraska. Anything stick in your head? The piano, the upright piano is still ticking in the heat. Yeah. Anything else? Truck without an engine. I suspect this place is a lot like my place, and there are a lot of those on cinder blocks in people's yards around. Anything else? Yeah, those damp wads of cotton, right? Yeah, the fabric of the clouds. So this is in some ways a bunch of stuff, right? He's just sort of giving us a lot of objects and then cobbling those together. If you had to say, I'm not suggesting he has a thesis necessarily, but if you had to say what all this stuff kind of packaged together might suggest about this place, anything come to mind? What do you think he's saying about Nebraska by giving us all the stuff that's there? Everything left behind, essentially, right? It's just the things dropped off, yeah. So what I think is implicit in this piece that I like is there's a kind of writing prompt buried in here, right? Which is to say, and this is something I think is worth thinking about. And like I said, like all good talks, I have 3 points. And so here's number 1. I think if you're going to think about place as haunted, which is to say, think about what's not seen, right? What makes the place that you cannot actually see. One way to do that is to just go down, right? To dig in the dirt and think about what's underfoot. And what he's doing here is essentially a timeline. Like if you are writing about a place, whether it's real or fictional, and you could just make a timeline of various points in history, and then take a moment, and what I would suggest you do is just try to list all of the physical stuff that would have been there, right? And I'm talking about just objects. This might require some research. So instead of just saying like arrowheads, you might do a little research and think about what indigenous groups were there, and did they use arrowheads, and how did they use them? But to just start with physical stuff. Where I teach at Western Carolina, it's in a place called Cullowhee, so as you might guess, that was a Cherokee place. The university actually sits on what was a Cherokee village called Two Sparrows Town. And about 2 years ago, the university started building a new natural sciences museum, or a new natural sciences building. And they knew enough to know there would be life under the ground. So they brought in the archaeologists and the folks from the tribal council, and they started digging and digging and digging. And they found things from like the 10th century, corn cribs, stone ovens, they start pulling up out of the ground that are like under where I was like walking and eating a sub sandwich the day before. You know what I mean? And so there's this whole world under there that I had no real sense of. And in some ways, the 10th century is just unfathomable to me. There's just no way to even wrap my head around that idea. But what I think this can kind of give for us as writers is a way into those histories just by looking for stuff, just by digging for objects and looking for physical objects. So the first thing is just to find stuff underfoot. Think about what could be there under the ground, which is a kind of way into getting into history. And then spreading out, it's kind of moving horizontally after that. There's a book that's going to sound terrible when I tell it to you, but I think that it succeeds. And so if you're curious enough to go chase it down, it's a book by William Leasteat Moon, who is mostly known for a book called Blue Highways, where he drove only rural roads across the country. He avoided highways and interstates. But he has a book called Prairie Earth, where he takes 10 square miles of a town in Kansas, and he does something that he calls a deep map. And he just goes into that town's history in every way that he can imagine. He looks up its literary history, its myths, its genealogy, its geology, all of the things he can find, he digs up and thinks about. He calls this a deep map. Again, this does not sound interesting. I also hesitate to tell you that it's like 500 pages long, but it's fascinating what he does with all this material. And this is Nowhereville, Kansas. There's no claim to fame here. I think the book's argument is essentially every place is as complex as this place, right? If you start digging under the ground, every place has the same kind of richness and nuance that this place, this 10 square miles of Kansas does. And so I think if you start digging down and look for physical stuff, then the second point is then to just spread out from there and think about what that means. What were the lives that were being lived, that were touching and interacting with the objects that were there before? Even if that was 20, 30 years before. My colleague at Western, Ron Rash, has a novel called The World Made Straight that is in many ways about a kind of massacre that happened in the Civil War outside of Madison County. But the book is kind of consumed with this idea of thinking about the layers of history that are in the ground. And in some ways, that's what I'm asking you to think about. Go down. If you find a corn crib, what does that say about who was living there and what their lives might have been like? The third point is obviously the most important because this isn't just an exercise in historical research. You've got to be doing something with this place, right? What we're thinking about is how do you write about place? How do you bring place to the page in a really kind of nuanced and alive way? And so the third idea is essentially to think about that life that you're finding under the ground and then consider how it comes forward. How is that shaping the place now? And so this is the kind of haunting that I was suggesting. And if you are kind of interested and maybe believe in the idea of some sort of supernatural or spiritual haunting, then by all means follow that. But you don't necessarily even have to. What I'm suggesting is that those lives that are underfoot, all of the materials that are there, still shape that place even today. So an example that I'll give you is that the place that I grew up that I was telling you about earlier, when I was a kid, I spent a lot of time in those woods with my cousins. And so when we would set off to the barn, we would go down this trail. We would go to the creek, we would go down this trail. And that made sense as a kid. When I got older, I started thinking, who made those trails? My first thought was, it was my grandfather. But the more I sat with that, I realized, no, this was probably my great-great-grandfather who first moved to that land, who had to walk to the barn, had to walk to the creek, and cut these trails. Which is to say that the choices my great-great-grandfather was making 150 years ago about where he went shaped the ways that I interacted with those woods. He made those trails, I followed them, 150 years later. So his life in some ways is reverberating in mine. It's shaping the way that I was making decisions. And I think there's a lot of that, we just don't see it. I mean, I can't remember, it's been a long time since I've seen Ghostbusters, but don't they put on something where they can see the ghosts? Is there a helmet or glasses or something? Nobody remembers Ghostbusters. Let's say there is. For this, what I'm asking you to do as a writer is to try to slide those on and to see where those kind of reverberations might be happening from the past, what those objects under the soil might still be doing to that place today, how it might have shaped the way people live, shaped the landscape, shaped the way that people interact, all of those sorts of things. So I'll stop there with my haunted story, but those are sort of the ideas, to dig down, find physical stuff, spread out, think about the life that's there, and then try to bring it forward to the now and think about what does that say about the place now and how the people there are living their lives in that place. So thanks.
Does anybody have any, catch Jeremy while he's around if you've got questions for him and can help him We're going to turn now to our three student writers. We're going to hear first our fiction selection and then two poets. Olivia Nix is a junior at Oconee Christian Academy and hails from Seneca, South Carolina. Her short story focuses on the struggles and stress of high-energy jobs, such as working for the police or military, and the fear that people who work those jobs have about losing their loved ones. It's her hope that readers will come away from her story knowing that they are not alone in the stresses of life that they face, and that they can find support in one another, whether it be from a friend or a family member. Please help me welcome Olivia Nix.
Eovan couldn't run. The air felt like molasses as he tried to push through it, but he was still running at a snail's pace. Valerie was battling an unmarked soldier by a ravine with her face contorted in fury. Vaquin was already down, his blood staining the lifeless gray rocks. Bile rose inside Eovan's mouth at the sight of his brother's body. He willed his legs to go faster, but it didn't help. He was still too slow, and the battle ahead was too fast. The unmarked soldier found an opening in Valerie's defense and shoved her back against the ravine. Eovan tried to shout a warning, but nothing came out. His stomach churned as Valerie slipped and fell back into the void below. The winds cut off her scream, and Eovan nearly stopped. The unmarked soldier turned to him. His helmet covered his entire face and gave the vague impression of a skull. Eovan's jaw clenched and his eyes burned as he pulled out his pistol at an agonizingly slow pace and aimed at the soldier. He blinked, and the unmarked soldier was nearly upon him. Eovan tried to dodge, but the soldier was quick and was already sending Eovan sprawling on the ground before he could even blink again. Eovan looked up, and the soldier was coming toward him. He looked to his right, and Vaquin's body was lying motionless on the ground, his eyes glazed. Eovan's eyes burned again, and he tried to get up to lunge at the skull-faced soldier, but something stopped him. A quiet voice whispered in the wind. Eovan, it came, barely audible. The soldier was standing over him now, a pistol pointed at his face. Eovan shuffled away, but only succeeded in going a few millimeters. He raised his hands instinctively as the soldier pulled the trigger, and Eovan's eyes snapped open. His breath was coming in short gasps, and sweat dripped down his face. He passed a hand over his face. It was just a dream. Just a dream. He rolled onto his back and stared up at the cold tansium alloy ceiling. The ship had a quiet hum as the propulsion engines kept the ship running while it sat in the docking bay in Columbia, South Carolina. He sat up with a sigh and shook out his dark blonde hair. He got up and went into the hallway, heading toward the engine room. He placed a hand on the cool metal wall to feel the rumble of the engines. Blue light highlighted the silvery hallway and gave it a soothing glow. Navigating and calculating was always easier than dealing with dreams, or people for that matter. Calculations were straightforward, less confusing, less room for doubting. Models always told you what you needed to know without any hot air. Numbers and equations, one could easily get lost in the flow and rhythm of one solution passing into another. It all made sense and fit together in an orderly way so you didn't have to worry about conflict. Dreams, on the other hand, made no sense, were downright chaotic, and brought up things you didn't want to face or even think about. People weren't much better at times. They were also chaotic and all over the place. The science behind a society was always in motion and unpredictable. Worse was that personalities crashed and burned with one another. A lot. His mouth became a thin line. People weren't like this all the time, but many times he just found it draining to deal in social interactions. He sighed, and people said math was hard. Eovan came to the door of the engine room and punched in the access code. The door silently opened, and more faint blue light spilled into the hallway. Eovan stepped into the room, and the door slid closed behind him. He approached the central core and checked the fuel to see if they would have enough when they departed. With more than enough fuel, he moved on to conduct a routine inspection, despite having conducted one with Vaquin before going to bed. He tried to fill his mind with data the ship's gauges read to him, but the dream crept back into the forefront of his mind. The soldier with the skull-like helmet pushed Valeray down into the ravine. Vaquin's glazed eyes stared unseeing as his blood trickled across the ground. The soldier pointed his pistol directly at him. Evan grimaced and pinched the bridge of his nose. The scenes played over and over behind his eyes like a broken holographic projector. He tried to fill his mind with more numbers and data, but the more he did, the more the images fought to play at the front of his mind. He set his jaw and nearly ripped out a wire from one of the control panels. He stood up for a moment and let his racing heart calm itself. He took measured breaths and rubbed his hands raw. Every muscle was tense as he stared at one of the smooth monitors aimlessly. Its cool glow highlighted his baggy red eyes and well-defined facial features. His jaw was clenched, and he turned away from the console, heading out the door. The door silently slid open again, and he turned down the hallway to the kitchen. When he reached the kitchen, the softer, warm light let his eyes rest after endlessly staring at the screens in the engine room. He opened the fridge and scanned its contents. There were some beans, too much kava spice thanks to Valeray, a couple of instant meal packs for their surface missions and other systems, a little leftover beef from last night's supper, and a few greens. He sighed and grabbed one of the kava spice packets. He looked around to see if his brother or sister had stirred. The only sound he could make out were the hum of the engines and the occasional beep. He closed the fridge and began heating water on the stove. Oh, if Valeray ever found out he'd taken some of her kava, well, he didn't want to think about that. When the water began to reach a boil, Evan poured the kava into it and stirred it until the liquid was a warm, reddish gold liquid. He grabbed a cup from one of the almost empty cabinets and poured the hot drink into it. He sat down at the table and took a deep breath of the intoxicating aroma. Just like the first time his father had taken him, Valeray, and Vaquin to a spaceport. It had been the Columbia spaceport, ironically. As a child, it seemed so big and all-encompassing. It was probably the first time he'd realized that the world was far larger than he'd ever imagined. Columbia itself was a monster of a city, like a metal forest draped in blue, green, and silver. Despite the imposing sight, the shops of antiquity still stood amongst the towering skyscrapers. Now that he and his siblings were back in the city, it brought back some memories. The universe had gotten a lot bigger since then, yet so much smaller. A small grin touched his face. He took a sip of the bitter drink, and for a moment, the haunting phantoms of the dream faded into the cold heart of space. Valeray always knew where to get the best kava. Another small grin touched his face. Vaquin swore she was addicted to the stuff and said she'd have withdrawals if she ever stopped. He might be right, but that never stopped her. He took another sip and shook his head. Something else he guessed he'd never understand. Sure, he liked kava, just not as much as his sister. Halfway through another sip, he frowned. He saw Valeray falling into the bottomless ravine. He put his cup down. The soldier turned to face him. He put his hands on his head. He was moving agonizingly slow. He squeezed his eyes shut. Vaquin was staring off into nothing. Why couldn't it just fade like a normal dream? His eyes burned. Why? Evan? Asked a tired voice. Evan looked up. Vaquin was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. His dark hair was a mess. His dark eyes still looked half asleep, and his shirt was wrinkled from what looked like restless tossing and turning as he himself couldn't get to sleep. Hey, Evan said, trying to make his face as neutral as possible. What are you doing up? Vaquin shrugged. I couldn't sleep, I guess. So I thought I'd raid Valeray's kava supply. He grinned with a mischievous look in his eye. But it seems you beat me to it. Evan shook his head with a tired grin. I just took one pack. You can have the rest, but it's your funeral. I'll take my chances, Vaquin said, opening the fridge. Evan shook his head and grinned, taking another sip of his own kava. Vaquin took out a very generous supply of kava and started boiling a pot of water. He turned it on low, then leaned back against the counter. He squinted, then crossed his arms. All right, what's up? Vaquin asked. Evan raised an eyebrow. What? He put his cup down. Could you not get to sleep, or did something wake you up? Vaquin elaborated. I think the latter, but what makes you think I couldn't sleep? Evan asked. Maybe I just woke up with a craving for kava. Vaquin shook his head. You of all people don't just wake up in the middle of the night, least of all with a craving for Val's kava. Now, how would you know? Avon asked accusingly. I'm your older brother. It's my job to know these things. Vaquin grinned. Avon sighed. It doesn't answer the question, he mumbled. Yeah, sure it does. Now, what are you doing up? Avon looked down at his cup and ran his finger along its rim. Vaquin waited for him to say something. Avon still didn't look at him. He knew that saying it out loud would sound a lot worse or stupid than it did in his head. Vaquin crossed his arms and drummed his fingers on them. You know I won't leave you alone till you tell me what's going on, Vaquin said. Avon nodded. He definitely knew. Because whatever it is that can wake you up can't be good. Avon sighed. Maybe it would just be better to get it over with. I mean, but how could he even start? He started. It was a dream. He paused and looked at Vaquin, who gestured for him to continue. Valerie was locked in combat with a... He paused and scoffed at himself. Why did dealing with this stuff have to be so stinking hard? It was an unmarked soldier, he continued. They were beside a ravine. Vaquin's mouth became a thin line as if he knew where this was headed. He pushed her, and he stopped again. He took a sip of kava to quench his dry throat. She fell. She fell, and you looked dead. Avon's eyes burned, and he set his jaw. Your blood was staining the ground, and he couldn't say anything else. He looked away from Vaquin, his vision getting blurrier and blurrier. He tried to blink away the rising tears in his eyes. He heard Vaquin turn off the boiling water and sat down beside Avon. Vaquin put a hand on his shoulder. I'm sorry, he said. Avon gave a small nod. It could happen, you know, he said quietly. One wrong move and this job is a little much, you know. I know, Vaquin admitted. They sat in silence for a while, and Avon gained his composure. You gonna be okay? Vaquin asked. Yeah, Avon nodded. You sure? Vaquin pressed. Avon nodded again. All right. Vaquin stood up and went over to put some of the kava into the boiling water. He then leaned against the counter and downed half the cup of it. Quinn, Avon said. Thanks. Vaquin's brows knit together. Or, he asked. Listening, Avon said. That's the least I could do, Vaquin said. Still, thanks, Avon said. Then he frowned. What about you? Vaquin paused mid-sip. What? He asked. Why are you up? Avon asked. Vaquin shrugged. Couldn't sleep, he said simply, although Avon thought he caught the briefest glint of uncertainty in Vaquin's eyes. Okay. Maybe he had just imagined it. After all, Vaquin did have really bad sleep patterns. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Vaquin was struggling with something else as well.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Our first student poet is Rochelle Smith, an Indonesian-American student who's at Pickens High School in her junior year. Her poetry is about the feelings of confinement she's felt in a narrow, small-minded town, as well as the uncertainty that can come from regarding one's identity in a difficult environment. She hopes that through her work, readers will find comfort in assessing a controversial topic instead of hostility, and that they will learn to show their peers true compassion. Please help me in welcoming Rochelle.
Hi. This poem is entitled Kamu Tidak Tahu Aku. Translation, you don't know me. You think you know me. An expressionless face in a voiceless crowd. Another whitewashed second-generation immigrant. A percentage too insignificant to be a statistic in my own school. Yet, you think you know me. For my first words were never intended to be English. and I promised myself not to conform. My mother had to leave behind everything for the land of the free because your ancestors conquered and mine surrendered. Yet, you think you know me. Point out the lack of squint in my eyelids. Speak Spanish at me. Make me feel insignificant, less Asian, more deficient. Name a country next to Indonesia and I just might respect you, because I know you'll forget how to pronounce her name. Yet, you think you know me. How can you so easily call yourself a rightful citizen on stolen land? How many times will I suppress my culture to preserve yours? How much history can you erase before the story is rewritten? How can you believe yourself? Kapan kamu tidak tahu aku? Translation, when you don't know me. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Our second student poet is Carson Kohlenbaugh. This is the third year that Carson has read at our festival. He's a senior forestry student at Clemson University. That's right, you can be a poet even if you're not an English major. He's from Kennesaw, Georgia, and his work analyzes ecologies and landscape histories of the southern Appalachians and Piedmont. His poems appear or are forthcoming in Delta Poetry Review, the Ethnobotany Assembly, and Pine Mountain Sand and Gravel. Please help me in welcoming Carson.
Thank you so much to everyone who came out today, and also thank you to Dr. Searcy for hosting this wonderful event, which, as he mentioned, I've done for 3 years now. It's always been very fun, even when it was just a recorded video that I sent in to you that you put on the internet. I have 3 poems today, 2 shorter poems, and then a longer poem at the end. And I'll read these chronologically through the seasons, just so there's some sort of through line. So we'll go from spring into summer. This first poem is called Economies of Scale, and this was not written at, but written about the Musser Fruit Farm in Seneca, South Carolina, which is Clemson University's peach research farm. Economies of Scale. Out in the peach rows to witness the lifting spell of wintry death, grafting season, pink highlands emit sweet frills of sex and nectar. Technicians in the next acre set out with chests of sockets and cords, remote controls and the mechanical hunter. The buzz of its expended energy rises and vanishes in tractor engines, wind roaring sharply through silk blossoms. Matte wings trace codes in the sky, and the rapid hum of computed tracking alerts inhabitants of hanging gourds. 6 fleeing swallows cry out in alarm, their shock of warning coming not from frightened pupils, but from inside brittle bones, their breasts and legs tucked in decadent evasion, swooping gallantry performed in shrill whistles as they rally the guard. Synthetic minds think nothing of those delicacies. They lack talons, taste, their bodies present and absent in this sea of flesh. The drone's faint whirring ignores the warring birds and goes off to count each pale stem, every perfect row of trees, grand sweeping acreage. 3 miles above the whirring machine, turkey vultures circle in wide hoops, searching for the warm connections of new guts. Beyond them hangs the permeable film of sky and hovering rocks, satellites, moons, the dead vacuum shadows of empty space. Low down on the ground, flies search for rotting flesh, thinking only of liquefaction, the visceral taste that springs from their feet. They scan desperately in their only slim hours, never understanding sickly ripe fruit won't come for a dozen generations or more. This next poem is called After the Sacred Field Bend into gaps, warped as though breathing. Mountains rise beyond the woods, good home for a bobcat. Each peak a note beat on ridges, counting old stone rhythms similar to the songs of the principal people. These earthly formations hold inner powers, born of creation, which served to remind them of the beginning of the world and their responsibilities to it. The soggy impressions fade foot by foot into the tree line toward the crest of a homestead. The cat goes to slaughter rabbits, hens. It goes uncaught, an apparition, a sprite. But the young coyote who follows the scent will be hung on the wood fence as a warning, and we will not sing of it. We will not sing of slowing heartbeats after bullets, poisons tear through tender lungs and the velvet fabric of neurons. Just as we no longer sing the secret names of animals or offer branches, final meals to our kills, as we have never been reminded of the beginning of the world, and we do not remember our responsibilities to it. This final poem I wrote also last summer when I was working with the Forest Service. We were out in actually the Jocassee Gorges area outside of Sunset, South Carolina, and down at the end of that area, right on Lake Jocassee, is a mountain called Bootleg Mountain that burned in a large fire a few years ago. So this poem is called, oh, I have to say, this poem is called Looking Down as Abraham, which is a reference to this quote from, or this verse from Genesis, which comes right after the verse in which Lot's wife is turned to a pillar of salt. And the verse is, "And Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld, and lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace." So this is looking down as Abraham. This afternoon, coming over the mountains, my rosy skin coated in a thick body of sunscreen and dense pillars of sweat, irregular ripples collect into low peaks, untitled knobs which bend to pull fire up onto the dry ridges. The outcrops on Bootleg Mountain are sweltering and exposed. Its slopes are seasoned with drought and smoke. The last of the bear grass is in bloom, spilling over itself in lace, the result of the total burning of its body. Combustion signals a coming decade free from fire, a period worthy of flowers springing out of the furnace. I cannot begin to describe how beautiful they are. Bear grass, Xerophyllum asphodaloides, no name sufficient to describe how they convulse in gossamer petals, inflorescences ecstatic to greet the day, rejoicing to meet again in their snow-white elegance, that dry life surrounded by goat's rue, dwarf huckleberry, table mountain pine arching in stunted branches over the hillside, each one lost to the mesophytic earth. Black specks of char still coat the ground as we ascend the rocky hillside toward the summit, clambering up stone. There I saw fog rising from the lake like the dense smoke from the land, at this place where the wrath began, gasping over miles of blue air, witnessing the flesh revealed even as the forest buckles down in death. So perhaps there are some things better off in ruins. Why he struck down Babel and scattered our tongues, filled the lungs of the antediluvians to begin the world again, overthrowing the towns and the plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land, allowing for a greater diversity of melodies, for the covenant of the rainbow and the survival of the species. The value of such things lies not in the lifelessness of bonds, but in their explosive severing, the energy within, such as forces found in uranium after staccato bombardment by neutrons, atoms in the garden and the world in pieces, hydrolysis to form silicas that build up piling tides of sand and stone, to form the crumbling garden salts, which reduce the fields, which bring back the pomegranates, which we eat naked and scatter over the land undeveloping. This torching of reforested wildlands bursts from that older fury and burns the torch of a new era, saplings in a juvenile garden. Heading back toward town, my spent boots laced in yesterday's dust, remnants of the service road spill out in deer tongue, cane, silt, gravel. It is evening. At the street corner, students lift signs demanding we look back on the falling cities, the aching leveled plains and fetch water. Vehicles disregard the cries as they pass by. They go to the towers, they amass gold, profiting in the ills of guns, opioids, hard labor. Impressions of crushing marble flood the roads. Bricks run crimson from tortured mortar laid by bloody hands. An escalation, this building up of fuel. Weeds emerge in the faults of masonry. Tentative promises for flowers. Light wind from the west on the shattering streets. Thank you.
So good. Olivia, Rochelle, Carson, you see them sitting around? People, please go tell them thank you. It is, I told Carson this. So Carson was the first reader 2 years ago when we had the festival. It was like the one day in 2020, and 2020 would be remembered for other things other than the fact that we had to start our festival at 11 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. because of weather. Like 2 weeks later, everything was shut down. But a lot of things had to happen for us to back things up that day. And Carson was our first reader. And he started reading his poetry, and I was like, this is why we had the festival. And that's what I felt today when Olivia read, and Rochelle read, and Carson read. Like, that's why we had the festival. And Jeremy was fantastic. And now we're going to end with Carissa. Carissa Freiberger is the author of A Breath of Fresh God, which came out last year. And she was most recently an assistant professor of English here at Southern Wesleyan. 3 short personal notes about Carissa. Number 1, she is an advocate for writers as much as she is herself a writer. When she was here, she curated and published a collection of essays from a local high school, Daniel, and from a freshman class here at Southern Wesleyan. And that's just awesome. She took student writing and put it in a form where they could walk around with it and say, see this, I wrote this. And I love that about Carissa. Number 2, if you read her book, my favorite entry sort of comes in the middle. It's called Letters from Abroad, and it's a series of missives that she wrote while she was in Europe and traveling there in Asia too. And she's writing in Kazakhstan. She's in a church service. She doesn't understand the language well enough to keep up. She says a prayer, and a student who she taught the previous week comes over to her and whispers in her ear and translates the sermon for her. It's just an amazing moment of teaching and learning, a meditation on being in this foreign place and also experiencing God's grace. It's just great. And then the third and final thing is that Carissa's book forces you to be interactive. You can't go 2 pages without seeing a prompt for you to respond somehow to what she's written. And for that reason, because she's constantly asking us to stop, to listen, to reflect, and breathe, I am really glad that she'll be closing out our literary festival. Please join me in welcoming Carissa Freiberger.
I have had enough for one day, so I'm leaving the meeting early. After a few blocks of walking, I've almost arrived at my car when I am stopped short. A wave of scent washes over me, thick and sweet. The air is heavy with the fragrance. Something nearby must be in full flower. I look all around, but I can see nothing, only evergreens and leafy bushes with no color or hint of blossoms. Where is that aroma coming from? And why didn't I notice it an hour ago when I got out of my car in this same spot? Somewhere, an out-of-sight, tree-sized bouquet is pouring its perfume onto the passing breeze. I smile. this has happened before. It's just God's way of sending me flowers and reminding me that he is always standing nearby. I would like to open with a prayer. Lord, I thank you for all of the people gathered here and for this place where we can come together, and for all the places that you walk us through in the course of our lives. Help us to fully experience them and teach us to learn all that you have for us to learn from each scene that you put us in. In Jesus' name, amen. So good morning. I am very, very glad to be here with you today. And actually, that's what I really want to talk to you about, is being here, in this place, in this moment. Whether you're sitting in this room or whether you're with us electronically in some faraway room, I'm going to ask you to really be present and here with us for a few minutes. As writers and as readers, we're concerned with good storytelling. And when we think about that, whether it's fiction or whether it's storytelling in nonfiction, we think about the elements of a good story. So we think about strong, well-motivated, unique characters. We think about the plot and the message that any story has, but we also think about its setting. Without the setting, without where it takes place, oftentimes a story wouldn't make any sense. So if I wrote a story in which I had the character sit down and turn on the television set, but everything else I'd given in the story implied a Shakespearean sort of scene, my reader would do a double take. Whoa, what's that? Where did the television come from? So we have to have that setting, that idea. Now, we've heard some great stories today, and we've been taken to some great places. Jeremy took us to his cousin's haunted farm. Olivia put us in Colombia, but well into the future. Carson gave us a very unusual look at a common place in a peach farm, and Rochelle gave us a peek into her own private world. So writers take us to those places. And as writers, we have the opportunity to be tour guides and take our readers to fun places, unusual places, even imaginary places. So, for Americans, a place is an address. It's a spot on a road. It's where we stop on our way to somewhere else. So we're coming along the road and we get to 24601 Bishop Lane and we stop for a while. In Japan, however, addresses are not street numbers. Streets have no names at all. The addresses are block names or block numbers. They're more concerned with where they are than with where they're headed. In Eastern Europe, addresses are street names like ours, but oftentimes they're more concerned about where those places are near. And there are places in the city periodically that open where streets come not to a cross with four corners, but to an open area where people gather and things happen. And I might be more concerned with telling you that my flat is close to one of those places. In Czech, they are Náměstí, in Russian, Plošť. And I might think about being close to that, close to the place where things happen, rather than so concerned about which spot on the road as you're traveling somewhere else my place is. In Russian, Krasny Plošť is Red Square, the place where government takes place. But we Americans are always on the go. We are always headed somewhere. I am personally very much American in that. I have not spent an entire month in the same state since April. I'm always headed somewhere. And my mother always muses. When she gets stuck in traffic, she kind of looks around and she says, look at all these people who aren't satisfied with where they are, but are headed off to go somewhere else. Now, on one hand, all that traveling we do as Americans is great. We get to experience lots of places, lots of cultures, lots of different circumstances, lots of emotions in those places where we are. But sometimes something is lost. when there. Now, I'm guessing that some of you are probably on your way to somewhere, and as you're sitting here, you're thinking about what you need to pick up before you go to your next class. Or your stomach's rumbling a bit, and you're thinking, I wonder if I'm going to have time to stop and get something at the grill when this is done. Anybody having thoughts like that? It is almost lunchtime. I won't make you admit it out loud. But I am going to ask you to set those thoughts aside for a few minutes and practice really being here and present in this place and being aware of what that means and where it is. So I'm going to ask you to start by looking around a bit. Just look around where we are. What do you see? What can you identify that you hadn't noticed or hadn't taken note of in this place? What color shirt is the person in front of you wearing? And think of it, not just as blue or green or yellow, but what color blue or green or yellow? What intensity of color is that? Who's sitting next to you? Do you know them? Do they have a backpack with them? Are they taking notes? Are they looking at their phone? What kind of shoes are they wearing? What's the ceiling of this room look like? You know, we often don't notice what's above us. We just look ahead as we're headed down the road to wherever we're going. Now I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a minute and concentrate on what you hear in this place. Now I'm talking to you, so you're hearing the vibrations of my voice, but I want you to think what else you can pick out. Are the lights buzzing? Can you hear a conversation happening out in the grill area? Someone fidgeting in their chair? Listen for a minute, and I want you to give those sounds, give them names. Think about whether they're high or low. Think about whether they're rhythmic and regular or whether they're random. Do you know what they are? Or are they mysterious? Now give attention for a moment to what you feel. You've been sitting here for a while. Is your chair starting to get kind of hard underneath you? Especially those of you who are sitting in the wooden ones. Are your feet cold? How do your clothes feel? Is something too tight? Is your stomach rumbling? Give those feelings names. Now think about what you smell. Does someone near you have perfume or deodorant that smells strong? Can you pick up food smells from out in the grill? Are they enticing? Did someone around you forget to shower this morning? Now, taste is a little hard to do in this context, but what about the emotions you feel in this place? How do you feel about being here? Are you comfortable? Have I made you nervous? Is this really just a very weird exercise? Are you bored? Have you been in this place before? If you have, what emotions about this place do those previous experiences bring up for you? Now I want you to stay aware of what you've noticed, what you've seen, what you've heard, what you've felt in this place, aware of this place. And I want you to bring in an imaginary element. Explore its imaginary possibilities. It's as if you were writing a story set in this place. And in your mind, I want you to bring in something that's not here. Now, it can be as simple as your sister or your boyfriend coming in unexpectedly and sitting next to you. What if the lead singer in your favorite band walked in to get a cup of coffee? Kind of stir would that cause? Perhaps a coffee-loving dragon walks in. In your mind, I want you to describe this newcomer. Think about how they look, how they move, what they do. Maybe our dragon is a bit clumsy, and as he turns to order his coffee, his tail sweeps all the cups off the table behind him. Take a minute and make up a story. Okay, open your eyes. But remember what you brought into this place. Remember the scene that you're in this place, as well as the scene you just created by bringing something new into it. Where we are affects what we experience there. So I want to tell you about my experience in another place that's on this campus. I received an email inviting me to a communion service in a chapel I'd never heard of on the Southern Wesleyan University campus. I had to ask a student where to find it. On reaching it, I realized I had passed this little church on my way to school every morning, but I'd never noticed it. It was dwarfed by the modern residence hall that sat next to it. The marker called it Freedom's Hill Church. My shoes tapped noisily as I climbed the unpainted steps and entered the tiny wood-slat building. I slipped into the shadowed interior and took my place on a flat wooden bench that bore the marks of ancient termites. Something about this place felt familiar. Maybe its scent, its essence. Oddly, I was reminded of my visits to European cathedrals. How could this plain antebellum American chapel compare with the grandeur of Canterbury or Westminster Abbey? Rather than soaring cathedral towers, its low ceiling stood close above my head. It exhibited no ornate furnishings or candles or streams of stained glass sunlight. Rather, two plain oil lamps and dusty glass chimneys burned on either side of the lectern. A rough wooden cross decorated the front wall, yet the sense of similarity persisted. I later learned that the little church was originally built in Chatham County, North Carolina. Its abolitionist pastor, Adam Crooks, and his flock suffered great persecution as the result of taking an actively anti-slavery stand in the small North Carolina town a dozen years before the Civil War. But the committed congregation refused to back down. Bullet holes still adorn the church's original door in memory of their devotion to justice and freedom. The building was moved to the Southern Wesleyan campus in 2000 for historical preservation. Here, in this unembellished wooden church, common people who trusted God took their noble stand against the enslavement of fellow human beings. On the bare wooden bench where I sat, they conversed with the same God to whom the cathedral choirs sing. Years of faithful service and sacred presence had sanctified this space. It needed no pipe organ or famous works of art to mirror the great cathedrals. In this simple place, where God has been worshiped for generations, their prayers have soaked into the walls and polished its hard wooden pews. Those prayers infuse the air around me with the scent and essence of a cathedral. On that quiet morning, I discovered not so much a breath of fresh God as the lingering scent of a God who has dwelt among those who have gathered in his name for many, many years, and who still inhabits this peaceful sanctuary. I did indeed discover a sacred place, a cathedral, a place to meet with God. Some of you have been in that little chapel, others have not. When we're writing, the key is to focus on our audience, our readers, and help them experience what we have experienced, either real or imagined. Now, we think of some place that's familiar to us, and it needs no more than its name to give us the essence of where it is. If you're an athlete and you mentioned the gym, someplace you've been a lot, you don't need any more description to have a sense of what it's like to be in that place. But as your reader, it would not bring up the same things for me. So when we're writing, we need to tell the reader things that we don't notice anymore, things that are beyond our thinking about them because they're just part of what we experience there. But we need to help the reader experience those. So we need to describe the clanking of the weights, the scent of disinfectant on newly cleaned equipment, the feel of sweat drying on your arms as you're working out or finishing up a workout. When we write, we have the opportunity to take our readers on a trip and have them experience someplace we have been. But we have to describe it in full detail for them to get it, even though we don't notice those details anymore. That involves stopping and being really present in that place for ourselves in a new way, and remembering, noticing all of those details that we have a tendency to pass by. Now, for me, place has been a bit confusing in the last few years. I have been living, this question of where do you live has been really complicated. I have been living both in Colorado and South Carolina for about 4 years. We've recently moved back permanently to Colorado, but for a long time people say, where do you live? And I'm going, what is it you really want to know? And which one should I tell you about? Because that place has been complicated. So for a minute, I'm going to take you to my other home state and talk to you a little bit about Colorado. My husband and I are 14er climbers. That means that we climb mountains that are 14,000 feet above sea level or higher. In Colorado, there are 54 such peaks. My husband has climbed all of them. I have bagged 17 summits, and that is a term. Peak bagging is a thing, and people are very proud of how many summits they have stood on. So this story is set in a place called Chicago Basin. It's very remote. You get there by taking the Silverton train, which in a very American fashion is going from the city of Durango to the town of Silverton. And along the way, it stops about 30 miles from everywhere and kicks all the hikers off. And they throw our backpacks off the baggage car onto the ground next to us, and the train goes on its way. And we are there and have about 4 miles to walk into the basin where we can set up our tents and set base camp. From that place, we can climb about 4 of those 54 14ers. In this story, my husband and daughter had taken off early in the morning to bag Wyndham Peak. I hadn't been feeling well the day before, so I had opted to stay in camp. But by mid-afternoon, I was feeling better and decided to go on a shorter hike to see a couple of high mountain lakes. So this is called At 13,000 Feet. I begin my climb, step by steep step, going up and further up. I cross and recross a stream punctuated by cascading waterfalls. The bright sunlight diminishes as the clouds darken, gradually changing into threatening, swirling shades of gray. The colors of the flowers marking the edge of the trail wash out in the fading light. Then comes the thunder. Far away rumbles at first, but drawing nearer and getting louder. Suddenly the rain begins. Will it just sprinkle a little, or am I going to get really wet? More thunder. This high-altitude hillside is treeless and exposed. It will only become more so as I near the top. Should I go on? Lord, should I go on? Yes, go on. I will protect you. And so I climb some more. Drops begin to pour down my neck and drip off my nose. The rain turns to tiny hail. Thunder rumbles. I meet hikers coming off the peak. They are doing what they're supposed to do. Rule number 1, when it thunders, get off the mountain. I can see judgment in their faces. They caution me to be careful, and they continue bailing off the peak. Lord, should I go on? Do you trust me? Am I hearing you? If this is just me doing this, it is foolhardy. But if I'm hearing your voice telling me to continue, I'll go on. Will you do foolish things if I ask you to? Do you trust me? Yes, I trust you. And so I keep climbing, past more incredulous downhill hikers. More thunder. It's really pouring now. I wipe the water out of my eyes. My shoes are squishy. Lord, may I sit under that rock and wait this out? Yes. I leave the trail and brave the muddy slope to a little protected ledge. I sit down, ignoring the puddle of water flowing off the cliff onto my makeshift seat. I'm soaked enough now that it hardly matters. I usually hate being wet, but somehow this is okay. I watch the rain and hail pound the rocks as I listen to the crashing thunder. Finally, the rain begins to subside. The rumbling moves into the distance, and a bit of blue appears on the horizon and grows little by little, minute by minute. The rain stops. A marmot waddles out onto a rock below me and looks around. He chirps indignantly when he sees me. After all, I am trespassing on his hillside. For a moment, the sun breaks through the clouds. The valley beneath me glows. It's stunning. I take its picture, knowing that my camera can't possibly reproduce its glory. The clouds take over the sun again, but the blue continues to increase. Time moves on. I stand up and bat at my hopelessly dripping hiking skirt. Oh well. I slip and slide my way back to the trail and begin to climb the rock steps again. I cross the creek, more granite stairs, another switchback, and another. I think of Elijah, who walked 40 days for an audience with God. He saw the wind and the fire and the earthquake, and then he heard the voice of God speak in a low whisper. Just as I reach the ridge and peek over into the high mountain basin, the sun wins its final battle with the clouds. I gaze into the depth of two emerald and turquoise gems set in the marbled green of the tundra. The wind, blowing backward off the retreating storm, ripples the water, and it glitters in newfound sunlight. I am alone. Everyone else has prudently scurried down the hill, in keeping with due diligence. I sit on the ledge above the lake. The sun warms the rock around me. My skirt begins to dry. The water trickles. The breeze whispers. A pika squeaks. And I hear in all of it the still, small voice of God as I sit before the throne. I write a few phrases to describe it, knowing that my word picture can't possibly reproduce its wonder. I give up scribbling and eat a protein bar. Pointy spires across the basin reach toward the few cottony clouds that remain in the sky, while the calming lake paints watery pictures of them. I praise the God who built the mountains and who fills the lakes with rain and clears the clouds to bring out the sun just for me. I pray that he will help me remember, as I go back home, to keep trusting when I am tempted to turn and run from the places and the jobs that he places before me, especially when the threats are less easy to identify than thunder. I ask him to remind me of the thunder and the sun shining across the glowing liquid jewels. My skirt is nearly dry. It's time to head back down the mountain to make dinner on the pocket rocket gas burner back at the tent. I've spent the afternoon in the throne room of my king. His presence has calmed my heart. I am content. When we're writing, we don't only give the reader an experience, we also give them a message. And the place where we're writing in informs that message and helps us tell the story. Whether we're writing an essay or a fictitious story, we write with something to say. So I'd like to have you visit a couple of other places with me. We're going to go on a bit of a whirlwind tour here. The point of this essay is about the unique and creative genius our God is. But I couldn't have told that message without taking you on a trip to some interesting places. This is called the Gallery. My husband David and I weren't ready to settle down when we got married. So we sold most of what we owned, put the rest into storage, and took up residence in my aging Datsun. We were just a couple of kids setting off on a grand adventure together. We didn't know that we were embarking on a tour of the greatest museum of fine arts ever collected. We saw no Picassos, or Rembrandts, or Da Vinci's. Instead, we discovered the glorious works of the great master himself. During the next 3.5 months, we covered 16,000 miles of highway, plus a few dirt roads, from Florida to Canada, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Home was anywhere we pitched the heavy, old-fashioned canvas elk hunting tent that we carried on top of the Datsun. My dog, a husky timber wolf named Pascanel, shared the back seat with our ice cooler. As we set off across the United States, we noticed the masterpieces beginning to appear. Each turn in the road brought before us another magnificent work of art. It began with a lovely watercolor, a beach scene from the Gulf Coast of Florida. We stepped across the concrete sidewalk that framed the piece onto a stippled white beach. The sand was so fine it coated our feet like sugar on a donut. A calm green sea lounged in the background, rising and falling with each new brushstroke, while baking figures lay on colorful towels, accenting the brightness of the shoreline. The artist drew bold arcs across the sky, using swooping seagulls and pelicans as tiny paintbrushes. 2 months later, we viewed a very different seascape off the coast of Oregon. The waves tumbled down the canvas as if trying to beat each other to the shore. They crashed against the darkly shadowed rocks, sending columns of water 20 feet into the air. A wave didn't have time to subside before the master splashed the white froth of its successor on top of it. The seagulls here seemed to have been drawn in with a pencil, small, lonely V's against an angry gray sky. Another painting appeared before us as we camped in the thick forest of the Ozark Mountains near Arkansas's Buffalo River. In the charcoal air of the growing dusk, hundreds of shades of green blended and twisted through and around each other, yet remained distinct. In contrast to the deep greens of the woods around us, a stark white cliff rose out of the murky river in the background. The colors were deep and rich, as if the paint were still wet, as if only a few minutes before the artist had stood there, adding final details to his canvas. Later, at Craters of the Moon National Monument in Idaho, we found the volcanic remains of God's artwork from many years ago. We descended into a dark cave where lava once flowed like a steaming subterranean river. Now, the temperature never rises above freezing. The beam of our flashlight revealed a curtain of frozen lace crocheted across the back wall, where the water has been slowly dripping for centuries. That night, our tent stood on a mound of crushed lava. The light from our cooking fire choreographed strange dancing shadows across the volcanic sculptures that surrounded us. For a moment, I wondered if our flame might reignite the long dead fires inside those rocks. As a sculptor, the master has achieved a level of accomplishment which human artists can only dream. His statues don't stand still like the ones we see in city parks or on courthouse lawns. God's sculptures walk and fly and eat. One, a great bull elk, joined us for brunch in Canada's Banff Park. His great rack seemed cast in bronze, stretching 4 feet from point to point. The morning sunlight shone across the powerful muscles of his shoulders as he walked through the brush behind our tent. Pascanel strained at her leash and barked, but the bull only lifted his regal head and stared at us with dark, liquid eyes. Then he went back to chewing leaves. We watched in respectful awe until he finished his breakfast and disappeared into the trees. Mental photographs of these works of art still hang in my memory, though we have long since settled down. We now live inside a beautiful oil painting, a landscape depicting a quiet Colorado mountain valley. The master constantly revises the picture, adding gold to the trees in the fall and covering the landscape with white each winter. He often lets us watch as he splashes pastel pinks and corals across an ice blue sky around a disappearing gold-ringed sun. If I look, I can see his signature in the clouds. Watching the master at work reminds me that he has commissioned us as the curators of his great global gallery. In his honor, it's our job to care for these paintings and look after these statues. We are cast as both admirers and caretakers, in this world which he is constantly recreating. I guess it's time to go back to South Carolina. Find what I'm looking for. Forgot to mark this one. So let's get on an airplane to go back to South Carolina. What was once an impossibility became a rare and awe-inspiring miracle on the day that Orville was lifted into the clear North Carolina sky. But now we've forgotten the wonder. Now we wait boredly. We board boredly. We stow our bags and sit down boredly. We stare straight ahead or into our phones, not even acknowledging the fact that we are defying gravity. We are no longer thrilled to find ourselves lifted from the earth and soaring heavenward. I fear that we may have become bored also with the one who lifts our souls to heaven. So as we come to a close, I want to give you a chance to respond a little bit. Have I got a little bit of time left? So rather than make this a question-answer period, I want you can ask questions if you like, but I'd like to give you a chance to respond in any way you like. And if that can include you telling us something about the scene you imagined at the beginning, that'd be great. Tell us what happened here in this place in your mind. So anybody would like to say anything? Wonderful. Get to see someone new in this place. Someone you've missed. Okay. Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Well, I want to thank you for traveling with me this afternoon. And exploring some new places. I want to thank SWU and thank Dr. Searcy for inviting me and letting me come and talk to you this day. As you go, I want you to think about not just going somewhere, but paying attention to where you are and really experiencing it and looking for what God has to say to you in each place that he takes you. I'll be here for a little while. If you want to talk to me individually, I'll be upstairs with my book there for a little bit. So thank you all very, very much.
Thanks so much for being here. I wanted to take a chance to combine the insights that Carissa and Jeremy gave us in our keynotes. If we are truly present, we will recognize the way in which the past is informing where we are right now. So this stage here, I showed up at 8:15, and it was already set up because the SWU Student Activities Board with Wes Pate and his crew made sure that this space was ready for us. So thank you to Will and Michaela and Madison and Chandler and everybody who helped make that happen. And we were able to broadcast this today and record it because Dr. Lewis Knight and our media comm team last Thursday sat there with IT people like Warren Dennis and Ryan Garrett and a student, Brian Roach, and a lot of camera people and made sure it would work today. And we were able to bring Carissa and Jeremy and compensate them for their time because SC Humanities gave us a grant, and TJ Wallace in particular let me submit my grant application a day late, and Roger House, our VP for Finance, signed a form for me so we could get that money and make it possible. And the reason I wanted to do it is because A, the SWU faculty, administration, staff, and particularly my humanities colleagues, Ken Myers and Mike Keaton and Paul Schleifer and Sarah Watkins and Lewis Knight, supported me. And then most of all, the reason we did this today was because of Rochelle and Olivia and Carson. And so what I want to do is to say thank you again to them one more time and to thank you for being here. God bless you. Thanks for being here.